In this list, I'm counting down the 10 archetypes from Yu-Gi-Oh! GX that I would love to see get extra support. GX is in an interesting spot because while the anime really started focusing on robust archetypes, Konami didn't start crafting competitive ones until the tail end of GX with the likes of Glider Beast and Lightsworn, neither of course which was featured in the actual show, and engines like Destiny Hero notwithstanding. Over time though, Konami has released support for many GX era decks as recently as the past few months with Clear World, Yubel, and Horus, but there's still quite a lot to work with. Now bear in mind that there are over 50 archetypes showcased in GX, so getting this list down to 10 was extremely challenging, but here are some things to consider. A. How good is the existing support for an archetype? Basically, even if an archetype has a ton of support, if it has never been competitive or functioning, it could still be due for more support. B. When was the last time the archetype received support? Many of the archetypes in GX have received some cards even in the last 3 to 5 years, so those that haven't get bonus points here. And C. How relevant was the archetype in GX? Again, over 50 archetypes in the series, but a lot of these were in filler-esque duels, so the relevance of the character, while not the main criteria, played at least some part in determining the top 10. Let's count it.
Number 10.
Mokey Mokey, used by Motegi aka Bolowski. Mokey Mokey is one of the more famous meme cards of Yu-Gi-Oh! Alongside the likes of Shape Snatch, Bean Soldier, and Sandwich. In the anime though, Mokey Mokey is seen only briefly, when Judai duels Motegi and then in a brief shot of a duel Motegi is in during Gen X. Motegi himself is an interesting character. He can see duel spirits and was formerly the best duelist at Duel Academy, until he had to be locked away because everyone he dueled would get high and fall asleep, which I guess is why the pillow-looking monster with wings is his ace. For the longest time, Mokey Mokey had only itself, the fusion of 3 of itself, and a single supporting spell to its name, all of which came out in 2004, but 2022 saw the addition of a 4th card, a retrain called Mokey Mokey Adrift. Mokey Mokey also appears in quite a number of cards' artwork throughout the game's history, so Konami certainly hasn't forgotten the little guy. All we need now is for the card designers at Konami to get so high they concoct an entire Mokey Mokey archetype.
Number 9.
Dark Scorpions, used by Don Zaluk. This is another deck used in a one-off duel, but it does at least have relevance to the plot of the 7 Stars arc, aka the Shadow Riders. Dark Scorpion also sticks out to me because A, they're one of the first archetypes ever, and B, they actually came out before GX in 2003 across 3 sets, and then were never heard from again aside from their appearance in GX. Don Zalug in particular was a staple at the time of its release, and Chick the Yellow is infamous for a loop that landed him on the semi-limited list, but otherwise they've been irrelevant to the card game for nearly 2 decades, evidently serving a 20-to-life sentence. The whole theme of a gang of burglars is a great concept for a deck both artistically and conceptually, so I'd love to see Konami release this gang of burglars from their prison.
Number 8.
Ojamas, used by Manjome aka Chaz. Ojamas are Manjome's spirit cards, and while largely seen as comic relief, play on the noble theme of just because you're weak and tiny doesn't mean you can't accomplish big things when you work together. Specifically, when they are together, something happens. Ojamas came out in 2003 in Dark Crisis, so another entry here that technically debuts before GX, but their connection to the series is undeniable. Ojamas have received support as recently as 2021 with Ojama Pink and a new boss in Ojama Emperor in 2020, though they still have ways to go to be competitive. Ojamas have always been a teamwork type deck where you need to get out as many of them on board to access more powerful effects. Another aspect to them is the ability to lock down the opponent's monster zones, most famously known for Ojama Trio. A third way to build out the archetype would be to, as Konami has softly done with Ojama Simulation and Ojama Match, is to connect them to the Armed Dragon and VW archetypes in order to craft a full-on Manjome deck. I am for any of these options, just as long as something happens.
Number 7.
Vehicroid, used by Sho aka Cyrus. The Vehicroid archetype is comprised of anthropomorphic versions of vehicles, so think trains and submarines and bicycles. Basically, it's the Pixar version of all of those. The Vehicroids came out in 2005, received a decent wave of support in 2017, and then one more card in 2021, but the deck still has a lot of room for growth. As it stands now, it functions by getting out fusions of different Roid monsters, transforming the little engine that could into the Industrial Revolution. There's just 2 problems. First is that given that most of the members came out so long ago, there isn't much synergy, so it relies heavily on those few new cards. Second is that the in-archetype fusion spell doesn't work on most of its fusions since they don't have Vehicroid in their name. The second problem could easily be fixed with the release of the manga-exclusive Ultimate Machine Union, but the first part will take either a serious overhaul of the monster lineup or a lot more spell and trap support. Basically, this Roid deck needs to go on roids.
Number 6.
Cloudians, used by Amon aka Adrian. I'm not sure how many Cloudian fans we got out there, don't worry, I got you. But since their debut in 2007, Cloudians have received just one card of support, Cloudian Aerosol in 2019, so they are long overdue. This is a counter-based archetype, specifically using fog counters to control the duel by trading those counters for card advantage. The deck isn't much more robust than that since it came out when archetypes still weren't very competitive, but I think that approach makes a lot of sense. When you think about weather and specifically clouds, you think about rain and storms and other things that get in the way of people's plans, so the archetype lends itself to a stun/control deck. It could also be interesting to tie in Amon's Fog King and Fog Castle, the latter which hasn't been released and the former which is significantly nerfed compared to its anime effect. But since Fog and Clouds are seemingly in the same family, looping it all in for one Amon deck would be my forecast for future support. And no, I don't think we should go the extra step and loop in Exodius to this deck.
Number 5.
Alchemy Beasts, used by Amnel aka Professor Banner. Like I mentioned in my top 10 Kaiba cards to support list, there are some concepts you would think are no-brainers, like genies or clowns. To me, Alchemy is on that list, and yet this is another one of those decks that have not received any real-life adaptation at all, unless you count the tangentially related Macrocosmos and Helios which Amnel uses. I think the concept for this deck lends itself to the playstyle, where you transform these different metals into summoning monsters. The anime in particular plays on the banished and element aspect, so basically how each concoction sets you up for an explosive final play the way Amnel executes it.
Number 4.
Darkness, used by Darkness, aka Night Shroud. Darkness is the final antagonist of the series, and as such, you would expect he'd have some cards out already, but of the final deck he uses, only 2 cards, Darkness Neosphere and Darkness Destroyer, have been released, way back in 2011 and 2008 respectively. The way his deck works is randomly setting and randomly activating a very powerful trap lineup with the aforementioned Neosphere as the boss monster. I think this concept is very interesting, though I wonder how practical it would be for players to shuffle their back row without getting accused of cheating. But I am a bit of a sucker for trap-based decks since traps don't get much love nowadays, so some sort of adaptation for the final boss would be great so he is not left in the dark.
Number 3.
Chemicals, used by Misawa aka Bastion. Of the many things Misawa is famous for, or infamous for, one of those is having a bunch of different decks, though the only ones we see are the Magnet deck and the H2O deck. I suppose someone super ambitious may try to combine it all into one science deck, but for me, I'd rather build on the latter into a full-fledged chemical deck where you get different reactions depending on which card you combine. Basically, each card would have chemistry with another. The premise of a chemistry deck is a bit similar to an alchemy deck, though of course this would rely more on scientific precision, like how 2 hydrogens and 1 oxygen make the water dragon. But whatever the approach Konami takes, please do us a solid and make the fire dragon a reality.
Number 2.
Venom, used by Cobra aka Viper. Of all the candidates on this list, this is the one archetype that has been released, but has never received a single card of support after its original debut. So 17 years overdue on this one. And if I had to pick one GX archetype to get a full makeover, it would be this one. And so you may ask, well, why isn't it at the top of your list? Well, the list is at least somewhat objective, but Venoms are my personal preference for an overhaul. The way this deck works is that you have these Venom monsters that put Venom counters on other monsters, and then a few cards that take advantage of those counters in some trivial way that was power crept even for 2007 standards. The other side of the deck is the boss monsters, namely Venominion and Venominaga. The latter specifically is a Towers-like monster with full immunity to targeting and effects, and it even has a win condition by inflicting battle damage 3 times. Though you can imagine that given the era it came out, it is a chore to summon. The problem with this archetype, aside from the lack of support, is that the 2 sides of this deck don't really talk to each other. So all your Venom counter-producing Little Snakes contribute nothing to the boss monsters, other than the fact that the bosses gain 500 attack per reptile in your grave. And then the bosses have nothing to do with the Venom counter side of things. So the first objective with revamping the Venoms is tying this all together, whether that means draining the swamp and retraining all of its members, or just a ton of support to make the Venom counters worthwhile and more consistently bring out Venominaga. Personally, I'm partial to win conditions, especially when they don't revolve around stalling or playing solitaire, though if Venoms ever do become relevant, Snake Rain could become busted real fast.
Honorable mention.
The White Veil archetype. There's not a single duelist who uses this, so I'll attribute it to everybody's favorite cosmic entity, the Light of Destruction. This makes my honorable mention because it technically isn't an archetype even in the series, since the Veil itself isn't tied to any of the other cards. The Veil is used by anyone in the Society of Light, and then we see Asuka and Manjome use white-themed monsters, like the White Knight with an N used by Asuka, and the White Knights with a K used by Manjome. But since it's all in the same white themed family, let's pretend it could be something cohesive. The Veil didn't come out until 2017, and the only other reference we've gotten to it is Armed Dragon level 10 White, which allows you to search it. The reason why I think this would make for a good archetype is because of how important the Society of Light is to the series, specifically Season 2, where just about all of Judai's friends get brainwashed by Sayo, and everything at the school gets bleached. This idea of a bright white light that people blindly follow in a cult-like fashion is a strong candidate for getting its own deck, and any archetype based around it could build on White Veil's effects to stun other cards with its blinding light, as well as transforming monsters into their white counterparts, a la Armed Dragon White.
Number 1.
Arcana Force, used by Sayo, aka Sartorius, and along with the White Veil, the archetype that best represents the biggest evil force of the series, the Light of Destruction. Arcana Force is yet another archetype that debuted way back when, in 2008, but has since received just 2 cards of support, Arcana Reading in 2020 and Arcana Force 15 in 2024. Sayo is one of the more memorable villains of GX, but his deck is perhaps the most memorable of villain decks because he duels so regularly compared to the typical villain. His deck is also very much in lockstep with his character and the plot and theme of the season, which makes it all the more frustrating that it hasn't been given more to work with aside from the couple of flyers. Building out this archetype has a few approaches, none of which are mutually exclusive. One is new Arcana monsters, which, like the latest 115, have good effects regardless of your coin flip. 2 is rewarding you for your coin flips, so even if you get a bad effect, you have other effects to compensate. And 3 is cards that let you create your own destiny, though I know that some folks take issue with that, essentially getting away from the intent of the coin flip aspect of the deck. No matter how Konami decides to support the deck though, all eyes are on the World, which has the sick ability of skipping your opponent's turn. If this archetype sniffs anywhere near competence, the ban list will make like a meteor and hit the World. So that's my list of the top 10 GX archetypes due for support. With so many interesting archetypes from GX, it was difficult to narrow it down to 10, but for good measure, here's the rest of the candidates I was debating between. On the left, you have archetypes that already have their fair share of support but have never achieved meta status. In the middle are archetypes that have received support in the last 4 years but aren't overly saturated. And on the right are those archetypes we saw sparingly but still left a strong impression. Going down each of the lists, my most preferred on the left is More Crystal Beast, my most preferred in the middle is Fossils, and my most preferred on the right is the Curry deck used by the head of Raw Yellow. But let me know what you think and which archetypes you'd love to see get more support. This list is of course just one person's list. Your comments here will definitely help prioritize which decks get custom support on this channel. So be sure to like, share, and subscribe because I am now in my GX era. Get your custom on.